The human necessity of sleep is often underestimated, a nightly surrender that we rarely stop to consider. It was always meant to be an unconscious gift, a profound void where the demanding chaos of wakefulness simply ceases. Yet, for most of recorded history, achieving this oblivion was not merely a biological process. It was a laborious act, a precarious negotiation with discomfort and circumstance. The medieval bed itself tells a tale of luxury mixed with inherent risk. These vast, elaborate structures, canopied, piled high, with feathers and expensive wool, were monuments to status, demanding physical space, but offering little in the way of true comfort or safety. Sleeping was an act that simultaneously signified deep privilege and profound vulnerability. The slightest ailment, the subtlest drafts, a sudden shift in temperature, all magnified the nightly ritual into something fraught with anxiety. To fall asleep was therefore not just to rest. It was to engage in a structured performance of unconsciousness. In a world where light pollution was non-existent by modern standards, and constant vigilance was required simply for self-preservation, the concept of deep, restorative slumber was an increasingly difficult commodity. The body demanded respite, yet society often treated sleep as a moral failing, a lapse of discipline, or a sign of spiritual weakness. What we are about to explore is the deeply flawed, darkly fascinating history of how people attempted to cheat this primal exhaustion. We are investigating methods that ranged from ritualistic poultices designed to ward off nightmares, through aromatic smokes intended to sedate the spirit, all the way down to questionable dietary regimens meant to induce a profound lethargy. The underlying narrative is one of desperate necessity. When natural remedies failed and societal pressures demanded wakefulness, humanity turned to anything that promised darkness. This search for tranquility was marked by an extraordinary cocktail of folklore, emerging medical knowledge, and pure desperation. Every herb found in the forest, every bizarre local ritual seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, the promise of that blessed, deep void. But this quest for oblivion was seldom clean. It was messy, steeped in biological hazard, and frequently bordering on outright toxic folly. The medieval mind viewed sleep not just as a physical need, but sometimes as a spiritual state, or even a battleground where restless spirits roamed. This belief meant that treating insomnia required more than simply blocking out light. It demanded an entire system of purification, one that incorporated the scent, the taste, and often the touch of the earth itself. The medicinal approach was holistic, encompassing diet, bath ritual, smoke inhalation, and even physical application of unusual unguents. It was a culture where the boundary between healing medicine and poisonous folklore was almost completely indiscernible. To fall asleep peacefully wasn't just about what you swallowed or inhaled. It was about establishing an entire environment a meticulously curated bubble of alleged calm that guarded against both fever dreams and spiritual visitation. We are diving into a world of natural remedies, yes, but also one where the natural could prove profoundly misleading. This is not merely a history of herbs and tinctures. It is an intimate look at human frailty, the deep primal ache for rest that drove generations to experiment with methods that today we understand would be nothing short of catastrophic. It sets the stage for our journey into the aromatic betrayals, the unsettling swamps, and the deeply questionable medicinal practices that defined pre-modern attempts to grant oneself the most precious gift, true oblivion. The search begins not with a simple drug, but with the grand, fragile promise embodied by the pillow itself. We often imagine the bedtime ritual as something gentle, a quiet slipping into oblivion. The soft glow of lamplight, perhaps the scent of lavender, and a gradual descent into unconsciousness. But for medieval people, the journey to sleep was not merely an act of comfort. It was a dangerous chemical experiment conducted in the dimly lit confines of one's own cottage. If modern aromatherapy offers gentle diffusion of pine or cedar, the methods available centuries ago were volatile mixtures whispered down from herbal lore and stained with desperate necessity. The medieval pharmacopoeia treated the body not as a cohesive system, but as an assemblage of humors, easily agitated by external stimuli. To quell a restless mind, a mind perhaps overstimulated by fear, poverty, or the relentless weight of divine expectation, the remedies often bypassed gentle teas entirely and leapt straight into theatrical doses of botany. Consider the intoxicating allure of the poppy. Modern understanding knows the risks of its opiate content, but in medieval Europe, it was a household commodity, a quasi-domestic sedative. Opium tea did not promise restful slumber. It promised oblivion, a potent, heavy drape that settled across consciousness and refused to be disturbed until morning's alarm bells, or perhaps a more permanent state. The dangers escalated with ingredients requiring less scientific caution and more primal folklore. Mandrake root, for instance, carried the weight of myth itself. It was believed that its heady fragrance not only induced slumber, but could also draw out subterranean spirits, making it an aromatic promise as potent and perilous as any sleeping draught. Then there were the leaves of foxglove, beautifully patterned, deceptively gentle in appearance, yet capable of inducing cardiac arrest in measured doses. To a layperson seeking peace after a night of anxieties or fevers, these herbs might have been readily available, their seductive power masked by the urgent desire to simply stop thinking. The methods were rarely simple ingestion. Sometimes the aromatic betrayal was achieved through ritual smoke. Bundles of dried, questionable flora, some mildly narcotic, others violently toxic, would be slowly burned in a hearth corner, releasing plumes that promised tranquility, but often delivered nothing more sinister than respiratory distress and headache. These treatments represent a profound misunderstanding of dosage and efficacy. What we now view as quaint herbal wisdom was, at its core, an attempt to stabilize the volatile human spirit using chemistry derived from nature's deadliest palettes. Every gentle puff of smoke or whispered sip of tea carried the latent threat of overdose, not just on the medicinal side, but on the purely toxic. And what of preparation? Sleep aids were not merely taken. They were part of a meticulous regimen involving bath rituals and poultices. The aromas themselves became an active participant in the body's chemistry. Was it the sickly sweet scent of nightshade mixed with chamomile that was truly sedating? Or was it simply the psychological ritual surrounding the burning herbs? It is difficult to disentangle the genuine medicinal element from the sheer weight of toxic folk belief. The process reveals a desperation, a yearning for control over one's own biology when the world was capricious, when illness struck without warning, and the social order felt fragile. The inability to simply command rest became a source of profound anxiety, which in turn demanded increasingly drastic, often deadly, chemical interventions. The scent promised peace, but delivered only a high-stakes gamble with the body's equilibrium. It was an aromatic betrayal. Beautiful promises derived from materials that held equal parts miracle medicine and slow, agonizing poison. Sleep was an act of profound inconvenience. In the sprawling, uneven architecture of a medieval life, rest was not merely biology. It was a dangerous luxury, a vulnerable hiatus between duties. If you fell asleep, it was either because you had succumbed to illness or by deliberate, sometimes ritualistic means. The pursuit of deep unconsciousness was therefore never simply about comfort, but about mastering an essential, yet precarious, state of being. It demanded ingenuity and often desperation. Chapter 2 showed us the allure and the agony of botany, the beautiful poison housed in root and petal. We learned that even attempts at gentle sedation carried a high risk of chemical mishap. The world's pharmacists were quacks armed with folklore as their primary diagnostic tool. But sometimes, when all else failed, when the herbs tasted too acrid or the poppies slumbered too shallow, the populace turned to the most primal sources of healing and filth. This brought us to the bathhouse, a place ostensibly dedicated to purification, yet historically rendered far more complex and vastly less sanitary. Forget the scented candles and eucalyptus steamers of modern times. The medieval soak was an experience that crossed lines of propriety that we would now deem uncrossable. These were not simple dips of cleansing. They were treatments administered in water sources, whose contents suggested a fascinating biological integration with their immediate environment. The medicinal bath, or balneotherapy as the scholars termed it, carried a profound and unsettling promise: renewal through immersion. The heat was meant to draw out poisons, the humors, according to Galenic theory, that plagued the body's systems, leaving the sleeper purified and ready for rest. Yet the ingredients cited by chroniclers are anything but pristine. To achieve the perfect cleansing cure, the mix needed mineral salts drawn from local marshes, perhaps muddy riverbeds, or deposits of ancient waste. The goal was systemic renewal, a wash that treated the body as an ecosystem unto itself. If the environment was suspect, then the bath's composition naturally mirrored that suspicion. We encounter accounts of therapeutic mixtures incorporating elements derived directly from the most localized biological realities, things that would today provoke immediate and powerful recoil. This wasn't simply adding scented herbs. This involved substances meant to draw out or balance the internal workings through external application. The process was less a spa ritual and more a muddy, prolonged medicinal sludge soak. The steam, thick with unknown vapors and localized organic matter, promised oblivion, yet delivered instead a dizzying cocktail of natural detritus and therapeutic intent. One could imagine the sensory overload, the scent of wet earth mixing with smoke-infused spices, all suspended in tepid, questionable water. The line between curative poultice and simple biological containment was dangerously thin. What differentiated these foul soaks from mere excretion? Perhaps only the conviction of the attendant, or the fervent belief system that deemed such methods genuinely medicinal. The intent imbued the filth with sanctity. It required a kind of detached academic admiration to examine this subject without simply recoiling. One must approach it like examining a beautifully preserved but utterly repulsive museum relic, fascinating in its history, yet deeply unsettling in its reality. These baths offered a false comfort, the illusion that all imbalance could be washed away with enough heated muck. They promised tranquility through total submersion into the questionable means of life itself. To drift off in such an environment would not merely be restful. It would be entirely immersive, demanding both the body and the soul to surrender their usual boundaries to the sludge and the steam. This chapter serves as a powerful testament to the desperation inherent in pre-modern healthcare. When the pharmacopoeia of science is limited to folklore and local resources, comfort becomes deeply compromised. Sleep was not gently induced, it was fought for, coaxed out of exhaustion, or washed away in vats that smelled less like rosemary and more like an unspeakable mingling of the earth and its refuse. The great swamp soak taught us a terrifying lesson. That necessity often makes sanitation the first casualty of healing. The body, it seems, views unconsciousness not as a natural state of respite, but rather as a physical problem requiring intervention. If the gentle descent into dreams was inevitable, then medieval science and folk wisdom responded with an arsenal of brutal efficiency. They did not merely suggest rest, they engineered it. The pursuit of sleep became a crude, desperate chemistry experiment conducted in bedrooms and alongside hearths, treating slumber itself as a symptom rather than a process. Our examination moves from the aromatic whispers of herbs to something far more visceral, the contents of the gut. We are moving into the sludgy science of ingestion. These sedatives were not crafted with an understanding of neurological pathways or neurotransmitters. They were concoctions born of necessity, desperation, and a profound misunderstanding of biochemistry. The core assumption was simple, almost aggressively literal. If the stomach could be upset enough, perhaps the mind would follow suit. The goal was not comfort, it was shutdown. We are talking about forcing surrender through chemical overload. Imagine a brew that tastes like an earthy compromise between pond scum and bitter root bark. This was medicinal tea, potent beyond belief, passed from generation to generation as the antidote to sleepless nights. These were often poultice-derived ingredients boiled down into steaming mugs of questionable efficacy. The taste itself was likely enough to induce gagging, let alone deep repose. But they drank it anyway, because in a world where bad dreams meant spiritual affliction and lack of sleep signaled weakness before your neighbors or rivals, the cost of passing up a potentially toxic tonic was far too high. But plant life, while dangerous, was merely predictable in its toxicity. The sedatives that followed were animal-derived, bringing a level of biological risk previously unseen in simple herbalism. Here, they sought potency by borrowing power from other life forms, the preserved desperation of the wild. We encounter preparations featuring bile, gall, and sometimes even parts of lesser beasts, all ground down, boiled into liquids meant to gently nudge consciousness toward oblivion. This was a pre-pharmaceutical era understanding of complex biological synergy. The sheer ambition of these formulations is staggering. Consider remedies involving bear's bile, or the bitter infusions drawn from certain swamp reeds and marsh fauna. These ingredients were not merely measured by cupful. They were treated as magical commodities, endowed with curative powers derived from their supposed predatory origins. The medicinal rationale often linked the strength of the animal to the depth of the rest it would provide, a sort of bioenergetic transfer across the gastrointestinal tract. The effect, when successful, was profound and deep. It wasn't a gentle drifting, it was a surrender, facilitated by a cocktail that chemically overpowered the system. However, success often carried a substantial price tag for the body itself. These sedatives were rarely single-purpose agents. They were designed to hit multiple systems simultaneously: the liver, the gut lining, and the central nervous system. The journey toward slumber was invariably accompanied by an aggressive digestive preamble. The physical passage of these remedies demanded a purgative component. Sludge did not just symbolize distress, it was part of the cure. To ensure that the poison or the medicinal weight passed completely through the system, the intake often included emetics and laxatives in devastating quantities. The process was designed to scour the gut clean enough that sleep could then follow in its wake. A mechanical cleaning so profound it bordered on the agonizing. And this brings us to the most unsettling chapter of medieval sleep hygiene: the integration of unsanitary elements into the cure. We have moved beyond merely consuming strange weeds. We are entering territories where basic concepts of cleanliness were non-existent, even by modern standards. If the body was a mechanism for rest and healing, then every component of its maintenance, the intake, the cleanse, the soak, had to be profoundly transformative, no matter how repugnant the material source. To survive sleepless nights required an acceptance of the visceral. You were taking in things that defied categorization. Biological runoff mixed with potent narcotics, all under the banner of achieving divine rest. The line between targeted medicine and sheer intestinal chaos became indistinguishable. Yet, for the medieval seeker of slumber, this sludge was salvation. It was the ultimate sacrifice to the gods of repose. The underlying scientific principle remains breathtakingly crude, but undeniably compelling. Everything was connected. Every ailment, every troubled mind, every failure to rest could be remedied by a drastic internal upheaval. The body had to be purged in order for the spirit, and therefore the sleep to find peace. These deep dive tinctures and forcing purgatives were not simply bedtime remedies. They were miniature industrial cleansings of the soul, achieved through the messy mechanisms of biology. It leaves us with a sobering thought. While modern medicine has advanced by millennia, occasionally we risk forgetting the foundational truth illuminated by these medieval excesses. The human body is unbelievably complex, and often its greatest vulnerabilities are the very systems designed to keep us running: the digestive tract, the metabolic cycles. By looking at this somniferous sludge, we confront not only a history of pharmacological desperation, but a stark reminder that in medicine, sometimes the most potent cure is also the most agonizing trial. This was not about gentle drifting. It was about being chemically forced into surrender, a demanding bargain struck with dubious biological agents just to earn the privilege of unconsciousness. It was a perilous and magnificent display of human while meeting raw chemistry, leaving behind a trail of digestive disorder as proof that slumber had at last been achieved. We have spent this journey cataloging the desperate measures taken to convince a restless body and mind was time to rest. We've seen the seductive whisper of night herbs, the unsanitary depths of communal baths, and the violent purging of potent bile. But throughout these chapters, one pattern has been alarmingly clear. For many in the medieval world, sleep was not simply a biological need. It was a profound failure of duty. The civilized life demanded constant vigilance. The body was expected to perform, whether in prayer, on the battlefield, or under the oppressive gaze of civic law. Rest was viewed less as recovery and more as abdication. And when rest became an act of abdicating one's sacred duties, it rapidly transcended medicine, becoming a kind of spiritual crime. Consider the cloister. Here, sleep was not merely discouraged, it was actively sinful. The hours were structured by religious obligation, requiring monks and nuns to keep vigil through the long watches of night. They maintained their consciousness with relentless chant and ritualistic study. To close one's eyes, to succumb to unconsciousness when duty called, was interpreted not as necessary recuperation, but as a dereliction of faith. The very moment of peaceful repose was marked by spiritual suspicion. The body became a resource to be managed, optimized for spiritual output. Sleep deprivation was thus transformed into a form of discipline, a grueling test of piety that pitted human biology against divine schedule. It is a far more harrowing ordeal than any poultice or poisonous root. This pressure didn't solely exist within the sacred walls. The military life presented its own brutal calculus regarding rest. A soldier who succumbed to slumber was seen as weakening not just his physical constitution, but his spiritual fortitude. Constant alertness was paramount for survival. From the watchtower guard through to the ranks of the marching legion, vigilance was a non-negotiable requirement enforced by cold discipline, exhaustion, or sometimes simple terror. The body in these contexts was reduced to a series of reliable mechanisms: eyes that stayed open, limbs that remained steady, minds that processed threat. The natural ebb and flow of fatigue were overridden by the rigid structure of command and the demands of survival. Sleep, therefore, was not just discouraged, it was treated as an enemy to be overcome by sheer willpower. And when sleep was sacrilege, new medicinal practices emerged, practices that operated less on internal chemistry and more on external coercion. If one could not trick the mind into compliance through herbs or baths, then discipline had to perform the work of wakefulness itself. The sheer exhaustion induced by prolonged activity became a state in its own right, often crossing the line from disciplined readiness into true physical collapse. The very concept of mandatory sleep deprivation carried a profound psychological weight. It speaks to an era where human willpower and collective adherence to schedule were believed capable of overriding even primal biological urges. Sleep was seen as a failing of character, a sign of weakness that required iron-willed correction. This societal pressure alone created a form of toxic vigilance, a state of chronic, low-grade stress and alert exhaustion, far more damaging than any medicinal overdose. The sleep tax can thus be understood as the invisible burden placed upon the individual when their existence is entirely determined by an external timetable or a collective expectation. The body cannot simply shut down because it has completed its task. It must remain ready for the next command, the next bell tolling, the next approaching danger. It forced people to build elaborate mental scaffolding, a system of hyperfocus and repetitive ritual designed not to achieve deep rest, but merely to survive until the next mandated period of wakefulness. The body became a machine running on spiritual gasoline rather than natural cycles. This unsustainable rhythm defined much of medieval life, an almost perpetual state of being ready, perpetually anxious, constantly awake. And this persistent, self-imposed, or socially enforced vigilance remains perhaps the darkest and most profound lesson in the history of sleep, a visceral reminder that for some, staying conscious was more important than the act of resting itself. The struggle to rest was not merely a matter of biology. It was an affair dictated by the heavens. In our desperate pursuit of slumber, man once looked upward, seeking wisdom in the celestial choreography that governed every life, including the fragile state of unconsciousness itself. The ancients understood something primal, that even sleep, this necessary surrender of self-awareness, operated on a divine timetable. Our ancestors knew that rhythm was medicine, and disrupting the natural cosmic flow was to court not just insomnia, but bad luck itself. The body did not operate independently of its orbital partner. The moon, in particular, held an almost irresistible pull over the tides, and by extension, many believed it exerted a similarly potent, if subtle, command over the very fluids within the human blood. When the moonlight was full, dreams were said to be vivid, often dangerously so, portals to realms more unsettling than waking life itself. Conversely, during the waning phases, lethargy set in, encouraging deep, profound exhaustion that bordered on catatonia. Medieval healers did not treat insomnia as a neurological failure. They treated it as an energetic misalignment. The culprit was rarely just too much work or too little food. It was often seen as an imbalance of humors, exacerbated by the waxing and waning power of lunar tides, demanding specific ritualistic adjustments to resync the body with nature's majestic clockwork. These remedies were less about physical sedation and more about restoring cosmic equilibrium. The seasonal rhythms played a parallel role. The passing years dictated not only the bounty of the harvest, but the very quality of rest. The extreme cold of winter was thought to contract the spirit demanding warming tonics and heavy slumber. Conversely, the lush excess of summer required cooling agents, bitter roots, and watery infusions meant to sweat out residual lunar tension. This wasn't a simple calendar calculation. It was a deeply holistic understanding that everything in life possessed both a vigorous peak and an inevitable decline. This knowledge gave rise to some profoundly strange pharmacopoeia, tinctures harvested not just for their chemical potency, but for their specific alignment with the moon cycle or the time of day. Certain herbs, considered perfect sleeping aids, were reserved only for the dark, silent hours of a new moon, when the earth's energies were said to be drawing inward and recharging. Others, conversely, needed the piercing clarity of the solstice sun to unlock their deepest soporific magic. The apothecaries who practiced these rites were not merely skilled chemists. They were astrologers, herbalists, and ritual conductors rolled into one unsettling profession. Their knowledge was guarded by secrecy, whispering remedies that seemed half botanical, half divine incantation. They taught that the ability to sleep deeply hinged on mastering oneself in relationship to the perceived cycles of the cosmos. It is crucial to understand this framework when examining their treatments. When a physician recommended a concoction steeped under specific planetary alignments, or timed precisely with the ebb and flow of the tide, they were not suggesting a random dose. They were attempting a masterful synchronization. They believed that by aligning the body's internal state, the humors, the spirit, the physical, with the macro rhythms of the planets, and the moon, true restorative sleep could be achieved. Yet this elegant understanding of natural timing was often prone to fatal misinterpretation. The potent magic tied to these celestial timings led practitioners to wild extrapolations. Sometimes the remedies worked, providing a gentle lull that mimicked deep repose. But more frequently, the ambitious blending of ingredients designed for peak cyclical power ended up overloading the system. A brew meant to calm the spirit under the crescent moon might contain an excessive dose of a nightshade relative intended only for solstice purification. The careful balance was always precarious, resting upon the whim of nature and the imperfect knowledge of man. The lesson drawn from these lunar cycles is one of beautiful futility. Humanity was endlessly fascinated by natural predictability, the predictable rise and fall of the tide, the dependable cycle of the moon, the reliable rhythm of the seasons. We looked to these cosmic patterns for answers to our most vulnerable state, unconsciousness. But the very act of trying to synchronize a messy biological process with an infinitely complex celestial clockwork only added another layer of anxiety and expectation. We were attempting to fit the unpredictable chaos of human sleep into the perfect, predictable geometry of the heavens. And in that pursuit, we merely exchanged one form of unrest, the ache of wakefulness, for another, the spiritual turmoil of cosmic obligation. The natural rhythms promised peace, but they delivered only more unsettling complexity, a slow descent into nature's most exquisite kind of toxic philosophy. We have followed a dizzying spiral through the medieval mind's desperate attempts to control the one thing it could not master, the descent into unconsciousness. From the botanical poison of the poppy to the visceral filth required for medicinal soaking, we saw that slumber was rarely viewed as a biological necessity. Rather, it was treated like a spiritual ailment, a failure of will, or perhaps a damning sign of sin. It turns out, in the medieval world, true sleep hygiene was less about promoting rest and more about performing compliance. The goal was not simply to fall asleep, but to be convincingly, ritually persuaded into it. If you couldn't coax your body into slumber with poison or sludge, you had to trick your mind. This brings us to the art of ritual, the dark sacrament of slumber. The early understanding of sleep was inherently psychoactive. The ancients and the medieval scholars both understood that the boundary between conscious thought and deep rest was porous. It could be manipulated through sensory input. Therefore, inducing unconsciousness became a performance, an elaborate psychological staging designed to trick the mind into submission. These were not simply lullabies. They were sophisticated forms of mental reprogramming. We move beyond simple aromatherapy or herb poultices and delve into techniques that sought to bypass biology altogether and target the pure realm of perception. In this context, sleep was treated as a meditative state, a highly controlled absence of self-awareness. Many of these practices required repetitive action, chanting, rhythmic recitation, or the sustained focus on a singular narrative thread. The monotony itself became the anesthetic. The power of rhythm is undeniable, whether it was the steady, mesmerizing chant of a monastic choir echoing through damp stone halls, designed to pull the petitioner's attention into an infinite loop, or the slow, deliberate drumming meant to synchronize the heart rate with a deep theta wave state. The goal was always the same: overload the sensory system just enough to make active thought impossible. I paid close attention to narrative. Storytelling held immense power in those times when literacy was scarce and entertainment was limited by candle wax. Epic tales, particularly those dealing with divine struggle or profound personal suffering, were used as soporific narratives. A skilled storyteller could weave an auditory tapestry so dense, so compellingly melancholic or thrilling, that the listener's own consciousness would simply drift away, overpowered by the sheer momentum of the words. The mind exhausts itself following a magnificent lie. The role of mandated prayer is perhaps the most sinister and deeply unsettling of all these rituals. Belief was not just internal, it was externally enforced. Monks were taught that deep rest, the loss of voluntary control, was equivalent to spiritual surrender. Therefore, sleep wasn't merely discouraged. It was treated as a moral failing, demanding active counter-effort. The continuous recitation of the rosary or liturgical texts became less about communication with the divine and more about maintaining an artificial state of vigilance, keeping the mind too engaged in its own sacred duties to sink into genuine unconsciousness. It is crucial to understand that when these religious demands were applied, they created a highly toxic form of psychological stress. This toxic vigilance required constant low-level adrenaline production, the mental equivalent of being perpetually on edge. It was exhaustive and deeply anxiety-producing, keeping the body subtly wired and unable to achieve the restorative deep sleep required for physical recovery. They perfected the art of wakefulness through dogma. If you were continuously told that your mind must remain open, alert, and ready for revelation, your natural sedative state was perceived as spiritual sloth. This pressure system created a constant internal conflict, the body demanding chemical rest versus the soul demanding perpetual performance. It is a psychological battle waged with prayer beads and scripture. And then there were more structured forms of hypnotic suggestion. These weren't necessarily religious, but they used the same principles of sensory focus. Sometimes this involved controlled deprivation itself, periods where light, sound, or even directional movement was systematically reduced until the mind, starved for stimuli, would begin to generate its own internal reality. The practitioner wasn't trying to give you herbs. They were emptying your head through sheer omission. The dark sacrament of slumber reveals that by the medieval era, the problem of sleep had morphed from a physical deficiency, a lack of medicinal drafts, into an intellectual and spiritual deficit. Rest was not medicine, but discipline. To fall asleep was to fail the self, or perhaps to fail God. This profound cultural pressure alone served as one of the most powerful and certainly least desirable forms of sleep aid in human history. I leave us with a sobering thought. These sophisticated psychological techniques, the hypnotic chants, the dramatic narratives, the forced spiritual wakefulness, were ultimately ways for society to assert control over the individual. They demanded that even your biological need for oblivion be subjugated to culture and belief. It wasn't enough to simply fall asleep. You had to justify how you were going to fail while remaining conscious. This intricate framework of performance anxiety, rooted in divine duty, is perhaps the most persistent form of sleep disruption humanity has ever invented. We have traced the profound desperation of a slumber denied. We saw how rest was once conceived not as an inherent biological need, but as a luxury fraught with risk, sometimes bordering on sin. For centuries, humanity viewed the loss of consciousness, the simple act of falling asleep, with immense cultural suspicion. But what happens when that necessity is weaponized? What happens when temporary non-existence becomes a calculated strategy? This next stage of our investigation pulls us from the dimly lit boudoirs of herbal poultices and into the brutal, uncompromising glare of conflict. We move beyond remedies for gentle insomnia and consider methods of complete and deliberate incapacitation, sleep as an enemy to be mastered or a foe to be neutralized. The battlefield is perhaps the purest distillation of this dark transaction between wakefulness and unconsciousness. Here, sleep is not a failure of piety nor a luxury. It is simply a vulnerability. The entire concept shifts. Instead of treating mild restlessness with mandrake tea or forced devotion through prayer, we are looking at ways to induce temporary systemic collapse in others. From the slow poison applied to an enemy's water supply to the debilitating psychological shock delivered just before a decisive charge. These were all forms of targeted, controlled chaos meant to bypass the natural defenses of the body and force a shutdown. Consider the tactical use of exhaustion. It was not merely a matter of distance covered or hours marched. It required an artificial depletion, a deliberate siphoning away of the vital energy that held the soldier upright. This was achieved through methods ranging from orchestrated skirmishes, designed to sap morale and strength, the perpetual chase leaving men drained and confused, to even the strategic withholding of basic needs, clean water, adequate nutrition, or rest itself. The body simply gave out under prolonged stress, forcing a kind of involuntary surrender that mirrors the medicinal goal we've been discussing, but with lethal consequences for the individual. It moves into psychological warfare as much as it does medical science. To convince an opponent to sleep, or rather, to become incapable of fighting, required undermining their very sense of reality. This meant not just chemical agents, though those were certainly present, from soporific gases to irritants that induced panic and subsequent exhaustion, but the masterful deployment of fear itself. The sudden cacophony of war, the sight of unimaginable horror, was often used in a paradoxical way. Overwhelming sensory input could eventually lead to a protective psychological shutdown, a form of trauma-induced sleep or stupor. This wasn't rest for recovery. It was temporary systemic paralysis. The methods were disturbingly sophisticated, far beyond mere physical brute force. There were specialized knowledge streams dedicated solely to the biology of panic and fatigue. How could one break the soldier's will without a single blow? Perhaps through targeted psychological attrition, the deliberate disruption of sleep patterns asterisk before asterisk battle began. Depriving men of normal, restful slumber for days in a secure camp was itself considered a potent weapon. It frayed nerves, degraded decision-making, and left men operating on an edge of exhausted paranoia, making them unpredictable and brittle by the time they reached the enemy lines. This concept culminates in what might be called ritualized exhaustion or controlled incapacitation. Imagine the slow application of stress to maintain a state that is merely asterisk below asterisk consciousness, a haze where action becomes difficult but not impossible, useful for capture, interrogation, or simply removal from the fight without causing permanent death. These were dark arts, techniques perfected through brutal observation. Understanding which combination of fear, hunger, low-grade poison, and relentless noise would force a man into a temporary state of pliable non-resistance. If we consider the darker corners of medieval combat medicine, it suggests that true medical knowledge regarding sleep was inseparable from its application in warfare. The goal was not to return the man to rest so he could function optimally tomorrow. The immediate goal was simply to make him incapable of fighting asterisk, now asterisk. The understanding of bodily failure, of when exhaustion would override resolve, was a profound and pragmatic military science, divorced entirely from any humanitarian concern for comfort or recovery. It is a chilling reminder that the concept of unconsciousness carries immense power. In times of peace, it was shrouded in mystery, treated with dubious herbs, and linked to divine grace. On the battlefield, it became simply another measurable variable, a target state achieved by chemical means, psychological terror, or sheer physical attrition. The banister between wakefulness and oblivion, which we have so carefully examined using poultices and prayers, is revealed here as a line that could be crossed with calculated brutality. To induce sleep was once the most profoundly sacred thing. To weaponize it remains one of history's darkest truths. The struggle to simply close your eyes was never benign. To seek unconsciousness in the medieval world meant inviting a host of biological and cultural failures, consequences that followed you long after the last drowsy draft had worn off. The historical record is not merely a chronicle of unsuccessful remedies. It is a detailed ledger of damage done by overdosing on mandrake root, damaged by internal purges, or simply etched into the psyche through relentless vigilance. Consider first the physical toll. When sleep aids were medicinal, they were often blunt instruments wielded without understanding dosage, creating an immediate cycle of dependence and systemic shock. A patient given too much poppy tincture, for instance, was not merely drowsy. They risked respiratory depression, plunging them into a dangerous void from which natural recovery was uncertain. The reliance on potent, unregulated compounds meant that the line between effective sedative and lethal poison was frighteningly thin, requiring nothing more than misidentification or a poorly calculated dose. The internal cleansing required by many of these sedatives carried equally severe aftereffects. While purgative sludge might briefly silence the mind's chatter, it left the body depleted, suffering from chronic dehydration and gastrointestinal distress. This established a devastating pattern. Achieving momentary rest necessitated an acute physical upheaval, leaving the individual profoundly vulnerable when the artificial slumber finally lifted. But the cost was not only physiological, it seeped into the deepest parts of the human experience, the mind itself. The cumulative burden of constant anxiety and mandatory wakefulness had its own insidious set of side effects. If chronic sleep deprivation was a threat in warfare, then perpetual vigilance became an emotional gauntlet for ordinary life. The cultural insistence on continuous performance of consciousness created a deeper form of fatigue. Monastic vows, the need to stay alert at the frontier, or simply fulfilling one's station, demanded a level of sustained cognitive effort that utterly defied biological necessity. This resulted in what modern science recognizes as chronic stress and anxiety disorders, a mental exhaustion far exceeding any hangover from foxglove tea. The historical consequence was often a profound sense of brokenness, a misalignment between the body's natural rhythms and society's rigid, unnatural demands. The inability to simply rest meant that even when physical cures were administered, true recovery remained elusive. Sleep deprivation became, instead, an ingrained state of anxious hyperarousal. The remedies themselves fostered psychological dependence. When people began relying on a specific foul bath soak or a soporific sludge to initiate sleep, the brain didn't simply forget how to rest naturally. It formed a deeply rooted expectation that unconsciousness could only be achieved through an external, often unpleasant, chemical intervention. This created a cycle of escalating reliance, turning the initial medicinal attempt into a pseudo-addiction, deepening the original insomnia with each passing failure. Furthermore, the darker side effects involved institutionalization and societal control. The management of sleep disorders was not simply about caring for individuals. It was often a means of disciplining aberrant behavior, those unable to adhere to prescribed schedules, or who experienced profound sleeplessness, were frequently labeled as morally deficient, mad, or demonic. Sleep disorder thus became conflated with spiritual failing or social deviance. The cumulative weight of these experiences, the digestive trauma, the nervous system strain, the perpetual guilt associated with rest, did not merely end when the treatment ceased. Instead, it left behind a persistent residue, a jittery awareness, an inability to feel truly grounded, and a constant underlying fear of returning to that uncomfortable void. The historical cost of attempting to command slumber was, therefore, often worse than the sleeplessness itself. It required a complete re-engineering of the self, simply to function within the harsh parameters set by society and medicine. This grim catalog of side effects, the empty bowels, the panicked spirit, the profound sense of being always on, serves as a haunting warning. It tells us that humanity's relentless pursuit of control, even over something as involuntary and primal as sleep, can inflict lasting damage. The quest for natural tranquility, when armed with toxic folklore and rigid expectation, was rarely benign. The ultimate irony is this: the rigorous attempts to medicate, ritualize, or suppress sleeplessness often succeeded only in making wakefulness a state of high alert, ensuring that even a moment of peace felt like an earned, dangerous commodity. The medieval man learned how to be perpetually stressed, forever paying the cost of consciousness for a deep, untroubled night's rest. This lingering exhaustion became its own dark inheritance. We made it. After centuries of desperation, of desperate concoctions and brutal rituals designed to steal the self into unconsciousness, we finally woke up. And what a beautiful, ironic morning we found ourselves in. We survived the poisoned tea, the swamp soaks, the bile-infused sludges, and the relentless psychological demands of the vigil. We escaped the literal boundaries of history, only to emerge into a state of profound modern exhaustion. Grand historical narrative was not merely about surviving wakefulness, but mastering it, optimizing it. And in doing so, we created an entirely new set of anxieties regarding sleep itself. The medieval struggle taught us that slumber was often dangerous, unpredictable, or a sin requiring atonement. Our ancestors believed rest was a privilege granted by nature, or perhaps only earned through sheer spiritual willpower. The remedies they employed, the mandrake root, the heavy doses of opiates, the internal cleansing rituals, were brutal attempts to forcibly align biology with an assumed cosmic order. But we found that the core ailment wasn't lack of technology. It was a profound misunderstanding of self. The irony is spectacular. By conquering insomnia in the modern age, by making sleep something quantifiable and measurable, by turning restorative rest into another set of performance metrics, we haven't cured our anxieties about it. We have simply modernized them. Consider the sheer complexity now mandated for achieving adequate slumber. Weighted blankets designed to mimic deep-sea pressure. Blue light filters meant to reassure our retinas that the sun, though absent, still holds dominion over our biology. Elaborate nightly routines built around maintaining a perfect cycle of REM and deep delta wave sleep. We have turned the natural rhythm, the simple, chaotic falling into oblivion, into an industrial process. The goal is no longer simply to sleep, but to achieve what modern science calls optimal sleep hygiene. This phrase carries the weight of immaculate performance, suggesting that if you falter in your routine, if your bedroom temperature fluctuates by a degree, or if you eat too much caffeine after 6 o'clock, then your entire physical and spiritual health is jeopardized. We are managing our rest like it's a portfolio investment, requiring constant monitoring, adjustment, and preventative maintenance. The deep-seated anxiety that defined medieval life, the fear of the night, the fear of sickness, the pressure to maintain vigilance, has been metabolized into self-diagnosis. The apothecary's dubious cure has become the wellness app on your smartphone screen, promising predictive insights into your mood based solely on how many hours you allotted for deep rest last night. We are trapped in a loop. We spend our day relentlessly overthinking our ability to rest at night. The medieval poor struggled with physical deprivation. They ingested what was available, the gut sludge, the dubious poultices, the desperate herbal brew. The modern affluent struggler faces a psychological deprivation of peace itself. Our enemies are not fever or lack of light, but information overload and the unrelenting glow of the digital scroll. The cultural pressure has shifted from performing wakefulness for God to optimizing unconsciousness for productivity. We no longer fear that sleeping will be sacrilege. We fear that suboptimal sleep will render us incapable of functioning in a hyper-efficient global machine. Sleep is not merely rest. It is the mandatory recharge cycle necessary to compete in the capitalist gauntlet. The modern irony, then, is that by understanding human biology so thoroughly, by knowing exactly what hormones regulate our slumber, and precisely how many minutes we must spend in alpha-theta transitions, we have failed to reclaim the simple magic of unconsciousness. We have treated a mysterious biological necessity like an engineering problem, waiting for the perfect algorithm. Our ancestors, facing oblivion with only poultices of toadworts and chance, meant to confuse the spirit, were arguably freer. Their failure was visceral. It involved literal poisoning or sheer exhaustion. Our own struggle is far more insidious. We suffer from the elegant anxiety that our best selves depend entirely on maintaining a perfectly calibrated circadian rhythm, lest we falter and lose ourselves in unmanaged oblivion. And so we stand here, modern inheritors of the ancient dread. We possess endless resources, the perfect mattress, the controlled environment, the bio-tracker. Yet we remain haunted by the same fundamental suspicion that our own minds are unreliable machines, prone to slipping into an unproductive darkness. The wisdom gained from centuries of perilous sleep aids has not granted us tranquility. It has simply given us a more sophisticated vocabulary for chronic overthinking. We learn about rest, but we do not achieve it, and perhaps that is the most deeply unsettling legacy of all. That even in our age of unparalleled knowledge, true, uncomplicated quietude remains